Dr. Mاجد القصبي, His Excellency the Minister of Commerce and the Chairman of the National Competitiveness Center, would like to introduce the session, please. تفضل دكتور.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all to the competitiveness talk at the National Competitiveness Center, where we conduct a series of knowledge transfer sessions to learn from international subject matter experts on topics related to global trends in competitiveness. The event is also an occasion to strengthen our partnership with renowned international organizations to share knowledge and learn from their experience in integrating productivity, sustainability, and inclusion, as well as ESG, environment, social governance, into the competitiveness agenda. On behalf of the business community, on behalf of all of you, please allow me to welcome our guest today, Dr. Francis Brouwan. Dr. Francis, thank you very much for your kind participation in the session. It's an honor to have you with us today, and we look forward to learning from you extensive experience and from Ireland's model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mاجد. And please allow me, Dr. Francis, just to introduce you very briefly. Dr. Francis is the chair of the Irish National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, a renowned academic and economist. She studied economics at the University College Dublin and was awarded her graduate degrees from Oxford University. Dr. Francis is currently a member of the European Statistical Governance Advisory Board, also the advisory board at the Fraser Allender Institute in Scotland, and the scientific advisory board at the Kiel Centre for Globalization. She has been a board member of various public bodies, including the National Board of Science and Technology and the Industrial Development Authority. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Francis Brouwan, where she will be presenting the Ireland's competitiveness journey. Dr. Francis, thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Salam alaikum, and thank you, Minister, for your welcome, and Dr. Iman for your kind introduction to this webinar this morning. I'm accompanied on the webinar by two colleagues from our Secretariat, Dr. Dermot Coates and Ms. Linda Kane. And I know that Saudi Arabia is engaging on developing its competitiveness agenda. And so my role today really is to tell you a little bit about Ireland's journey in establishing a competitiveness council and how that council operates. And it's obviously competitiveness is very often at the center of the economic development approach that countries are taking. And I think that's increasingly so. So if we could turn to the first slide, let me introduce what I'm going to say during the course of this presentation. Brief background on how Ireland has engaged in this journey. I want to tell you a little bit about Ireland just so that you can contextualize the various points I make. I will then speak about the role and work of the Council. And let me say at the outset, in Ireland, it's mandated to provide a clear, authoritative, thorough, accurate and focused up-to-date assessment of Ireland's competitive performance and to make recommendations to government on how Ireland's relative competitiveness position can be improved. So its role is to comment and to analyse what's there, and also then to make recommendations to government in that relation. And then I will look at the current and future focus of the Competitiveness and Productivity Council. So if I could turn to the next slide, please. So let me just give you, this is a very quick tour through Irish recent economic history, but I think it's useful to give you perspective so you can locate what I'm saying in a context that is relevant to you. So the Ireland currently has a population of around 5 million. It's risen from a population of about 3 million in 1970, so rapidly rising population relative to other European countries, but obviously Saudi Arabia would have had higher rates of growth. Our GDP per head is currently about $80,000 in 2015 prices, having risen sixfold again since 1970. So rapid economic growth, rapid population growth. We had, until the 1960s, an inward-looking economy with extreme protectionist policies that had run for 30 years and ended up with us having, in fact, what were the highest rates of effective protection in the world, with tariffs and quotas and prohibitions on foreign investment and heavy domestic regulation. So really closed inward-looking economy in 1960. So the 180-degree change towards internationalization followed from the perceived failure of protectionism to address a century of population decline that had started with famines in the mid-1840s. Our GDP performance in the 1950s was very weak. Immigration rates were extremely high. Innovation and R&D were minimal. And we had recurring balance of payments problems. So the government was very limited in what it could do. So the policy switch was then to an employment-focused, small open economy strategy, and it reflected a belief that this was the only way to stabilize the population, create employment, and promote growth. And I have to say, it has been an extremely successful strategy by any stretch. Ireland in the 1960s, the beginning of the 1960s, was unusual. I described it when I did my PhD work as being a semi-developed country, kind of mixed what was developed and underdeveloped. And when you have this mixture, it does have to inform how you address policy. So at the heart of the strategy was employment, because that was seen as crucial to economic growth and to stabilizing the population. We recognized we were price takers in international markets, given by how small we were. And therefore, we needed to have an internationally competitive production process in order to build economies of scale for a modern sector that could compete internationally. So from the early 1960s, we promoted inward investment, and there was FDI, on the basis that it would produce manufactured goods for export. For export, not for the domestic market, because the domestic market was too small to be a proposition to encourage international multinationals to locate in Ireland. This became later years known as building an export platform. It's now done in many, many countries around the world, but it was not a common strategy at the time. Ireland was pretty well a first mover in Europe, certainly. Singapore was beginning to move that direction in the same way, because again, it had similar types of features to Ireland about being small and wanting to be open. FDI was welcomed, and policy made it easy to locate in what was effectively a small island off the coast of Europe. So we were trying to use the European market as the place to sell, but remember, we're off the coast and accessible only by sea and air. So there was a focus also on regional dispersal to avoid over-concentration in government, in Dublin, which is the capital. But frankly, we did not have a good enough planning system, so we achieved less than we should have done, I believe, in terms of the economies of agglomeration and potential clustering outside Dublin. Until very recent times, it's begun to improve, but over a prolonged period, that was not a success. We decided, being an island economy, to promote ICT and pharma. This made sense because they have high values to volume ratios, and then transport costs are not a significant part of total costs. It turned out to be very pragmatically decided back in the 1960s, but it was a great move given the growth of these sectors in the last half century. The approach then was taken to be enterprise-driven. Each enterprise project was considered separately from the perspective of its sustainability, its job creation potential, and its regional location, with higher supports given to compensate for disadvantages of areas distant from the capital city. There was a close relationship between state agencies and the large enterprises, but clear rules were there to ensure fair treatment. And project viability in every case was paramount. So one of the things Ireland did manage to do quite successfully was avoid what are so-called vanity projects, which would be prestigious, but actually would not add to total growth. It was very grounded in solid economic project appraisal approach. The key policy interventions that were introduced were such that they worked and they've stayed in place, not just for years, but for many decades. And one of the things they did was they gave certainty to the investment approach, which was very important for business and something which policymakers in other countries, I believe, have not fully appreciated, because changes in regime make it very difficult for businesses to make decisions. So the approach was to have an automatic taxation relief strategy for manufacturing export sales, to negotiate grants for the new enterprises based on a project appraisal approach, as I mentioned, and have a transition to support established enterprises who were going to be entering new competition as we reduce the tariffs. So next slide, please. So this more or less continued from 1960. It evolved in a gradual way, but it continued until about 1990. And then globalization as a factor was becoming really important in the late 1980s. So the focus then shifted very particularly to non-EU foreign direct investment to serve the EU market. Prior to that, we were getting French and German, Italian investment, but this focus and strategy then was to outside of the EU, basically with the creation of the EU single market, our being a base for production within this larger market greatly enhanced our situation. I believe all small open economies in Europe benefit from the single market, and particularly so because of the ability to be able to produce for export. Financial globalization came along at the same time, and we built up a financial services sector, which has become a significant player in the financial markets. And also trade and services gave us an opportunity to build a strong software sector, which was attracted to Ireland by, I think, being in Europe, obviously, but also cultural and social environment, which we managed to develop, which they attracted both capital and skilled labor. At the same time, there was a growth in global value chains, which brought huge opportunities because you could now source easily without barriers from any part of Europe, your inputs into production in Ireland. But it did create an issue, which I want to draw attention to, which was that there was a big concept of local linkages prior to that. So local sub-supply was being tried to develop into FDI that had located, but that actually didn't make sense once you had at the European, didn't make sense, didn't work in the same way once you had this larger supply chain across the EU. So that policy had to be adjusted. At around that time, then very quickly, net immigration replaced net emigration for the first time. And in Ireland, one of the things we had at that time was a return of people who had emigrated to other countries, to the US, to the UK, across the world, who came back to Ireland with the skills that they had learned, and that was a huge boost, in fact, to domestic production in the late 1990s. So the policies adjusted. We had a reform of the corporate tax policy to align with the EU. As I said, we had the growth of the service sector. There was a big government policy to promote Ireland as a base for EMEA headquarters. There was a decision to invest in domestic R&D and higher level skills for the first time on a large scale, which had been there but not sufficient, and also on physical infrastructure over the 1990s, which had been underinvested in the 70s and 80s. And then also policies needed to strengthen the socioeconomic ecosystem, because effectively all business operates within an ecosystem, and if that's stronger from a socioeconomic perspective, business does better. So that led to a new focus on competitiveness and productivity. So at the economy level, it allowed us to begin to think more and more about who are we competing for in the market for goods and services, for foreign direct investment. At the enterprise level, in other words, how are our enterprises doing relative to their peers in both the domestic and the export markets? At the public sector level, relative to peer economies, looking at how other economies are actually doing policies. And at that time, we then had the establishment in 1997 of the National Competitiveness Council, where competitiveness is seen as a means to support the quality of living standards. So I want to, before going to that, it has evolved since, so to avoid any confusion, the NCC, as it was then called, has now evolved into the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, because it's now Ireland's Productivity Board. This arose because the EU Commission decided to establish productivity boards across Eurozone countries in order to get focus on this topic of competitiveness and productivity. Realization that this wasn't being done because productivity performance in Europe would have been slower than in other countries in the world. The government decided the NCC should be that body. And in terms of, because we actually had the criteria in terms of membership structure and independence, particularly important, and a work program structure that would allow us to take on that role. So very important to say that these EU productivity boards are seen as promoting growth and convergence across Europe, but focusing the eye very clearly on the tough questions around productivity. It is, you might say, quite remarkable that Europe was so late in doing this. UK had it, Ireland had it, the US had it, and some of the Anglo-American countries around the world had it, but this was new to Europe and very recent and working now very quickly. So can I just come to what the role that was seen for these national productivity boards? They were set up with the purpose of tracking developments and informing debate on productivity and competitiveness, contributing to enhancing the ownership of the necessary policies and reforms. And this is an issue which I think everybody trying to deal with competitiveness has, is that to keep it on the agenda, because it's often where people are having to make tough decisions and it can tend to slip off because the system very often will want to avoid bringing those to the fore. Their activities then that they have are very similar to what we have been having in Ireland already, analysing productivity and competitiveness developments relative to global competitors, to do research that would look at a comprehensive notion of productivity and competitiveness. And here we're talking about both a macro and a micro span, to assess the long-term drivers and enablers of competitiveness and productivity. And they're the ones we all know: innovation, investment, strength of businesses, human capital, etc. What's really important with competitiveness is to note that this goes short, medium, and long-term lens. It's always necessary to have all of the lenses there and not just one lens at any point in time. And the other point is to focus on non-cost as well as cost factors. So cost factors are very clear-cut. It's your labour costs, it's your insurance costs, etc. But it's also the non-cost factors, which can be, for example, the time taken to get a license or to get planning permission. So the idea is that you look at both of those. So the engagement then of the productivity boards across Europe is to raise awareness of the policy challenges with all stakeholders, to put this out into the public domain in a very transparent way, to assess the effects of the policy options by making trade-offs of policy explicit. This is a stated objective that we should have, that we actually talk about. And obviously with changing, evolving situations in the world, those policies become different and these trade-offs become different. To engage with a network across Europe to exchange views and best practice so that every country would learn from what other countries were doing within the European Union, and to publish an annual report covering the developments in the analysis and policy. And one key thing here from an economics perspective is the use of microdata to get a real handle on productivity, because we know world production is very much more complex, and without microdata, the kind of statistics that you have are not terribly meaningful. So if I could move to the next slide, please. So back now to our National Competitive and Productivity Council. Holistic basically is the word of the day. It's economy-wide approach to competitiveness, and it came out of realizing that it wasn't just the enterprise policies that mattered for businesses, but the whole environment in which they operated. It's an independent, non-statutory social partnership body, which joins up policy making across both departments and agencies. We report to the Prime Minister and to the government through the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So reporting to the Prime Minister is important because that gives it a whole of government stance. So while the Secretariat is located in the Ministry for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, the voice is the voice for the whole of government. Now, critical to its success in being able to have a position of influence is that the Council is seen as being unbiased, evidence-based in its approach, and that's where the importance of data and the importance of research that's done to underpin its reports, integrated into the policy and government system, so it's not operating as an ivory tower outside of the decision-making system, and that it's effective in its communications, and that means engaging in dialogue and doing advocacy for the concept of competitiveness, even sometimes when it's not the most popular topic that people want to hear about. So if we could turn to the Council governance, we have terms of reference that's set by the government, and the members and the chair are appointed by the minister. But that follows a competitive public sector skills-based nomination process. So it's a little bit like we do for a corporate board. You look at what the skills requirements are, and then you advertise the positions, and there's a selection process based on the criteria that you've set out, looking for the particular members that you're trying to fill at a particular point of time on the council. The current membership has people with relevant expertise, really in competitiveness, 6 of those, 5 who are directly there as employers, and 2 represent employers' organisations and 2 represent trade union organisations. The business members are very important to have on the board, because I think their active input is key to the acceptance of its views. Otherwise, it would be seen as policy making people interested in competitiveness, but without that grounding in business. Decision making is made by consensus. You work through drafts, you work through situations, and you have conversations till you arrive at a position which everybody is happy with. Meetings are attended by senior officials of 11 government departments, who are advisors to the council and who attend all of its meetings. But they're there more as listeners. The key point here is that when policy proposals emerge or recommendations emerge, they've heard the discussion already from the business people, from the council members. They're aware of actually what the arguments are. And then the research and analysis provided by the Secretariat function, which is within the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So if I could turn to the next slide. So the Irish approach then is an ability, we're looking at competitiveness as an ability to compete successfully in foreign markets and on the home markets, since we're open obviously to international trade, and the ability to attract and retain capital and skills. So capital and skills being more mobile now than they obviously were 50 years ago. We operate with a competitiveness framework pyramid, which was developed through the Harvard Business School, which distinguishes really, it's a framework, it's not a model as any economist would know, but it sets a context in which you can look at the essential conditions that underpin competitiveness, which would be the macro conditions, the institutions, and the natural endowments of the country. The inputs, which are the drivers of competitiveness over which domestic policymakers have greatest control, because there are many areas where policy does not have control. Outputs then are a measure of the success of the input indicators reflected here. And the ultimate objective is sustainable growth, which is national income and quality of life measurements. So this is just, if you move to the next slide, please, to put up the pyramid itself. You can see it's blocks. So the idea is that your basics are at the bottom. You could influence matters at the input level, but you're also looking at what's happening at the output level, some of which are affected by matters that aren't at the input level. So there isn't a causation chain going the whole way through. But the final attempt then is to look at getting more sustainable growth. So it's like a way of collecting the various factors together and then looking to see how we can measure our relative competitiveness under these factors. So you're looking for indicators in each of these areas. So what you'll see when we come to the next chart is just how busy that looks. And maybe we turn to that now just so that you get a picture of it. But it just gives you a sense that in each of these areas, so next slide, please, you're looking at each of these areas with metrics to capture and benchmark competitiveness within those. So there's a whole set of them. You can see just some examples there, and I know the slides have been circulated, so you can look at these later on. But this gives you a view of what we're looking at or trying to measure across the way. So down at the bottom, you have everything from regulation and ease of doing business to endowments, which would be population. You have then at the input level, you've got investment levels, you've got developing R&D investment, etc. Going up further, you're looking at the trade performance, the sectoral performance, employment performance, and then right up at the top, you're looking at the aggregate measures of success. So that's the broad framework that we collect indicators under. And we'll turn now to have a look at the selection of indicators, please, if you turn to the next slide. So the focus is on the essential metrics only. You could collect gazillion metrics. We focus on factors that are important for Ireland. So these wouldn't necessarily be the same for all of the European countries, but they would reflect issues that for us, we know where we have issues. The indicator selection evolves over time, but we keep as much continuity so that there's time series that you can look at. And all the time, you're trying to capture new issues of relevance. So, for example, in recent years, climate metrics would have come into the fore where they would not have been in the early part of the 2000s. There are several challenges with collecting these data. Data timeliness at the moment of both the WEF and the World Bank have delayed, for example, their production of their indicators for the year. So getting timeliness is crucial, particularly if a country is changing and changing rapidly, as can be the case. We focus particularly on the quantitative data rather than subjective surveys and perception perceptions based on indicators, because we find them more reliable. And I've been in other situations in other countries where their reliability is not as good as you would ideally like them to be. However, it is very important to hear from surveys of people in the enterprise sector how they're finding matters. So it's not to disprove them, but just to say that they should be, the quantitative ones are particularly important. And we recognize that it's the relative positions over time that matter. And also, and I think this is always appropriate to do, is to recognize that some issues do lie outside the policy influence, or if there is a policy influence, it's at quite a distance. Effective communication of the outcomes is important. We use, it's easy to do today, charts and pie charts and different metrics to try to be able to communicate as easily as possible so that journalists, the media, and people without large companies and research departments can actually look at the data and understand what it's saying. So if I could move to the next chart, please. So, as I say, what we do is we benchmark it through this competitive scorecard, and we look. So, who do we look at? And I think this is really important in terms of the philosophical approach. We look across 19 key competitor countries, and we look at about 130 indicators. Now, I would like to see some work done to see how we could see to what extent they work together, and you may not have to do as many as we have been looking at, but that has been the approach to date. And I say key competitor countries because there's no point in comparing yourself with somebody who you're not in the market for competition with. So what you want to do is get a clear assessment of competitiveness and get an evidence into the system about the strengths and the weaknesses of where Ireland lies coming out of that scorecard analysis. And that then becomes inputs into what we call our competitiveness challenge, where we lay out the recommendations to government, the analysis we've come up with, and the recommendations that are made to government for action. The idea is that this will stimulate debate and action from stakeholders throughout the system on our competitiveness performance. A key point, I think, is that the focus is on the competitiveness dimensions from a macro perspective, from an enterprise perspective, I should say, rather than a review of the macroeconomic performance, which has been tended to be for large countries sometimes plays a bigger role. We recognize that actually the enterprise perspective gives you a much clearer view on what you should be doing from a policy perspective. If I could move then to the next slide, and this is just a list to give you a view of just how those challenges have changed over the years. So this is every couple of years back to 1998. An early focus on skill shortages because we hadn't invested, infrastructure bottlenecks, we hadn't invested, and very underinvested in telecommunications. You then get into the early noughties, where there was a tightening of the labour market and a concern with the fact that as we got into 2006-07, the Council would have commented on the unsustainable nature of economic growth on a year-to-year basis and a rapid rise in private sector debt. So it put these issues out in front of everyone at a time when people were not necessarily, government in particular, wasn't necessarily delighted to hear about it. But the idea was that there was an over-reliance, for example, on construction as a driver of growth. So then it went on into, we had the financial crisis, and Ireland was particularly affected. The need for cost and wage adjustments were discussed. The return to productivity and export-led growth were key issues. And then as you move on into recovery, how we manage our debt, how we manage investment coming in, and renewal of our export performance, because that had been impacted. Not so much from the multinational perspective. Actually, the multinational presence in Ireland during the financial crisis was one of the reasons the economy continued to prosper extremely well. It was the exporting performance of the small and medium enterprises that were indigenously owned that were the main focus. So then back into 2015 to 19 is the focus on costs and getting the agenda onto a sustainable growth, and again, productivity getting an increased focus. And then obviously the last 2 years, and this is true all across all the European productivity boards, COVID-19 had a massive impact on how everybody looked at matters because of the, if you like, the acceleration of change that it was generating. And in Ireland, on top of that, we obviously had Brexit, with the UK, our major trading partner, leaving the EU. Climate change becoming a bigger issue, obviously, in the last 2 years, and the digital transformation. So just to give you a sense in which, while you're looking at competitiveness, the focus of where you are changes. And a point I would like to make, which quite surprised me, I have to say, was in relation to COVID. It became very obvious. If as a council, you are talking about competitiveness and productivity are medium to long-term issues. But if you're not connecting in with the debate on the short term, you don't get traction in terms of engagement. So it's really important to be short term, medium term, and long term in your approach. So if we could turn now to the next slide, thank you. So this is just what our outputs are. We have a challenge, which is a policy document focusing on the main competitive challenge, fixing the enterprise sector and the policies required, doing a cost of doing business report and a competitiveness scorecard. We're now planning to do those on a 3-yearly basis, and we'll probably merge them into one document because two separate documents doesn't probably get the kind of traction we would want to get from them. But then we also do reports on competitiveness issues such as Brexit, such as, for example, the concentration in the FDI sector, which I'll mention again. And then more recently, we've focused on producing some bulletins to talk about immediate issues where there's a lot of discussion and needs to be more and not to disappear off the agenda. And in many occasions, those bulletins can input into the future challenge document or come out of the challenge document, where we realise that getting traction requires the holistic approach of the competitiveness report, but also an individual focus. We also make submissions that are relevant to the council. We have, for example, a tax and welfare commission meeting sitting at the moment, so we would have made an oral submission to that council in terms of the work that's been done. And then obviously there's a lot of stakeholder engagement where we play an active voice in interacting with the major bodies internationally, with the national productivity boards in Europe, and then with bodies domestically. So if I could turn to the next slide, please. So setting the agenda, advocacy and communication. So this is really a kind of, it's the way in which if you have a competitiveness council, maintaining its role is very important in this context. So we target our influence through direct engagement with the policy-making system and through wider communications. So the direct would be meetings with the chair with the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. Also with meetings with the stakeholders would be the economic regulators, the enterprise development agencies that are fostering domestic development and inward FDI, for example, our competition authority body, which is looking after competition in the market and all matters related to that. The idea also would play the role in institutionalizing competitiveness in government. In other words, making sure that our reports go to what is called SOG here, the Senior Officials Group, Cabinet Committees, the Cabinet itself, and in memos to government. So you make sure that what you're doing in the active space transfers to the highest level within government. There's participation of the Secretariat members, and I mentioned 2 of them on this webinar with me, to conferences, and I also make presentations to conferences and engage with media when we make releases. We issue publications on an annual and quarterly basis, and what we're trying to do now is have a regular bulletin out on every couple of months in the media, so that we keep actually the voice of the council in current discussion. We have then targeted challenge for key communications. A general one doesn't work with something like competitiveness because it's so broadly focused, it doesn't get the traction of one individual journalist. So having that approach is important, and obviously having an evidence base in relation to each of what we do, what we produce is important. So if I could have the next slide, please. So this may be relevant to you in considering what you're going, but a major change that's been made in the last 3 years is that where previously the Competitiveness Council made a huge number of recommendations each year. In other words, it looked right across everywhere and made many recommendations. In a sense, the civil service system, the government system, couldn't really handle that number. And they said, look, you can't be, if you're going to produce that number, you're going to be producing them every year because there isn't going to be traction. Why don't we agree to having more focus and priority recommendations? So the idea would be that we would make a smaller number of recommendations each year, balancing medium-term issues with current issues, as I mentioned already, the COVID-19 example. So what happens is that we have agreed now to the smaller number, and we have also agreed that the government will respond directly within 2 months to what those recommendations are. So there's a public announcement of what the recommendations are, and 2 months later, the government says how it's going to address those recommendations. So we also brought forward the challenge to September to fit into the European semester system, which is its way of organising future years' policy planning. We've also worked with more in recent times with the national productivity boards as they're developing, and we're learning from them and they're learning from us, because across Europe, everybody's starting in a slightly different space. But one thing everybody knows is that we all need to understand the drivers of productivity in our economies. We need to know what's crucial in that relation. So that is becoming a new area to be included in our annual report at the request of the Commission. And we will be reporting on the activities and engagements across the other EU countries as well. So if I could move to the next slide, please. So current challenges for Ireland, and I put them from three different sources. The global ones, you'll be very familiar, they're the same, I think, all the world over. I'm sure if anybody had a list, it's there. New ways of working is one, of course, that's come recently in as a consequence of COVID, because we've realized that people can work from home more readily, and that there are ways of working smarter, which actually are quite interesting from the point of view of policy making itself. In a European context, there's increased focus on coordination and on competition. And Europe is also, from our point of view, are dealing with the UK exit under Brexit is dealt with through Europe, not directly through ourselves. So what are the challenges then from an Irish sense? Well, one thing we have, which we're very aware of, is a very high concentration of FDI by source. They're mostly American. By sector, they're mostly in ICT and pharma, but then that's where we looked for the investment. By enterprise, they are very, very big. They're the world's biggest companies, and they're all here in Ireland. But that means it's highly concentrated using any economic metrics of concentration. And by and large, they sell into the EU market. And if you consider the EU as a single market, yes. If you consider a range of different countries, it's many markets. But they're selling mostly into Europe and back into the EU. Back to the US in some cases. So that concentration is something that gives cause for concern in the sense of a global shift. We're seeing it with global source of energy changing, where changes in these areas would also have an impact. But we do have many companies in there, but they are in concentrated sectors. We've comparatively low productivity in sectors in the domestic SME sector. That's been discussed for many years and is now a very high point on agenda for understanding. There's a lack of competition in part of the non-traded sectors, and the innovation system domestically is still, I would say, quite weak because of our late start in that, our late start with investing in innovation, with getting links between universities and businesses, etc., which is now happening. We have a legacy of weak spatial planning. Currently, in terms of housing, it's very evident. But our infrastructure planning across the country has been by and large good, better than many countries. But it's so important that the infrastructure is joined up, because otherwise it doesn't make a lot of sense. And we've also got difficulties in organization planning capabilities. So these are matters which affect the quality of life of people, and ultimately that's the goal, is to have higher quality of living standards for everyone. So we've also got a requirement to manage increased complexity in the innovation and business systems, and that makes policy making has to be more nuanced, has to be more careful in terms of what it does, so that there aren't any accidental side consequences that one hadn't expected. So all of these acting weaknesses, if you like, or challenges for Ireland, we always use the word challenge rather than weakness. All of these have a bearing on competitiveness, and dealing with them will all help competitiveness. So I've got just two slides now talking briefly about sustainability and inclusivity. We had a full chapter on that in the 2021 report. And inclusive growth is from the Irish perspective or view on it now, is that inclusive growth is economic growth that can be sustained year on year. We've had, if anybody's ever looked at our growth rates, they have been highly, highly volatile. Taking a 5-year average, they look grand, but if you look year to year, that volatility. And that causes issues. And you would grow better if you can manage a consistent, good growth rate, rather than high some years, low other years. And the whole point is to have it fairly distributed across society, because that promotes social cohesion. And we only have to look around the world to realize how important social cohesion is. And at the same time, it creates product opportunities for everyone. Competitiveness and productivity is required to do that. And it needs to, if you like, respect the environment hence the sustainability, environmental sustainability high on the agenda now and delivers for everyone. And Ireland would have been, like many countries, with its head not too far out of the sand when looking at some of the environmental issues for a long period of time, because they do require quite significant changes, particularly for our agricultural sector. But the whole point about it is the recognition now that equality promotes growth, and that's what we should be seeking, a more evenly balanced society and economy in terms of gaining growth. So the focus is on having now with people having greater flexibility to choose where and how they work. That's a real agenda item that's out there. It will be, I think, much discussed over the next number of years, given the scale of change that was seen under COVID. We have pointed to the need for government clarity on the national approach to climate policy in the short and the medium term. So government has come out now with its climate action plan, but we were concerned for quite a period that the government wasn't giving, it wanted the private sector to be very active in this area, but we didn't feel it was giving a consistent set of policies across the short and the medium term. And that's really important because infrastructure investments related to climate are major, huge amounts of money. People will not do it unless they see a medium to longer term view, and we did not give that consistent environment. So we're moving to a carbon neutral society, which is going to affect sectors differently. And I mentioned the agricultural sector and also different regions of the economy. And the economic and social policies will be needed to actually manage that transition, because those who are going to be adversely affected in economic terms need to be taken care of in a system that allows them to develop other means of generating income if they are no longer able to produce in a way that they had been producing previously. So next slide, please. So the transition from oil to gas, from oil and gas to renewable energy. Again, this very much back to this consistent market signal as being there. There is now wide acceptance, and it's taken a while in Ireland, but we have got there, that moving to a low carbon economy is critical for future well-being and longer term competitiveness, because if we don't make the adjustment now, we're going to be having to do it in the future. It'll be more costly, and that will undermine our competitiveness. So in the action plan produced last year, the government committed to very ambitious targets to move away from fossil fuel and towards renewable energy resources, including increasing the proportion of renewable electricity from 30% to 80% by 2030. That's a huge, huge challenge, and will only be possible if there's a lot of coordination and a lot of good work between government and the private sector in order to do that. There's going to be huge infrastructure challenges, particularly with regard to the power system, having a grid that can work and be in a safe and secure manner. And I suppose one of the things that happened in Ireland, and I think really across the EU, and you can see it actually in the present discussions, is that the focus of energy policy became competitive prices to energy users, be they consumers or businesses, and less on security of supply. And as we know very painfully at the moment, security of supply is a huge issue. So having a grid system that can accommodate that is absolutely vital. So the transition has to also be fair and equitable, because otherwise it won't be politically acceptable, and at the same time meet the needs of the enterprise sector. So the enterprise sector will be having its voice heard, I suspect, very widely in the next while, so that it can remain resilient and competitive in international markets. So the high quality of investment and planning in the infrastructure area is really crucial. So just the very final slide, to say, well, what is the essence of the message that we give out? Competitiveness is key to creating good, well-paid, sustainable jobs, to growing the economy, and having high-quality public services. And of course, there's a synchronicity there, because high-quality public services actually feed into competitiveness by making it possible for enterprises to thrive. Productivity improvements are key drivers of competitiveness, and we need to look at those and understand better where that is working and not working, particularly for us in the small and medium enterprise sector within the economy. With a small domestic market, a healthy exporting sector is absolutely essential. And I don't know how big an economy you have to be. I guess you have to be 50 million plus before your domestic market is of a scale that you can ignore exporting. But I don't think anybody really can at this stage. And it's necessary really to achieve economies of scale for businesses. A vibrant exporting sector it can't happen without competitiveness. So it's a bit of a circle, you go around that circle. Your ability to do that and remain a member, for us, it's our ability to perform well because we're a member of the EU. It really, by being competitive and successful in terms of what we do with regard to our productivity, actually is important for us as a Eurozone member because of our common currency, and also to be able to withstand any shocks that affect us individually as a country. And one thing I'd like to say in completion is that there is, and we're working with the OECD's framework on the drivers of productivity, which is accessible, I think, to anybody outside, or we can provide information from you on that. But for us, that's a really key development going forward into the next while. So I hope that's been of some assistance to you. And Dr. Iman, back to you, and thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Francis. It has been a real pleasure to listen to all your thoughts. And I'm glad that we are hopefully on the same track. I'm sure you've been doing this for so many years, and we're here to learn from you. I think your council has been established 30 years ago, 1990 or 91. And
actually 1997. We're 25 years old in May. I just realized.
Very good. Okay, excellent. So we've got another 20 years to catch up with you, but hopefully we are starting wherever you have reached today. But allow me please to first open the chance to all our audience to ask any questions. If you have any questions, please either raise your hand and we'll open the mic for you to ask the question, or you can actually put it in the chat box and we'll read it from there. So the first question that we have received was Ireland's experience toward digital transformations to stimulate the competitiveness of micro-industry. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
So we have been, like all countries, discussing the digital agenda for some time now. And one of the challenges for us has been around, because of the composition of our economy, we have a lot of companies which are right at the center and to the forefront of a lot of digital activity. So we've got a big strength and presence in relation to that. Government has concentrated particularly on the digitalization of all of its services and trying to make more efficient government policy coming out of that. We have, I think, been less successful in joining up digital policy, and maybe one of my colleagues might want to address that. We've finally, the issue for us has been, where does digital sit within the various departments of government? And we've been slow at arriving at that. And I think it would be fair to say that we have a lot of work to do on digital. We recognize how all-pervasive it is. There's been a good concentration on the digital transformation within government itself. Within the wider economy, there's quite a bit more to be done. So I don't know whether Dermot, you or Linda would like to add anything on that.
Yes, I might have a go at that, Francis, and good afternoon to everybody. We're very happy to be presenting to yourselves. On the issue of take-up with regard to digital transition and micro-enterprises, typically the take-up by such firms in Ireland has been quite low. Now, the government has put in place digital online trading vouchers, which in effect is a grant of up to €2,500 for any small firm, I think employing 10 or less staff, to actually establish an online presence and begin to trade more online. But again, take-up historically has been on the low side up until 2020 with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, because what we see in 2020, the demand for those vouchers or those grants was the equivalent of the previous 5 years in just a 12-month period. Okay, so a lot of firms really kind of began to move into that space. And we see that in practical terms, in terms of kind of labour market disruption over the last 2 years with COVID-19. At the very outset of our first lockdown, which ran approximately March to June 2020, very high numbers of people would have been on our pandemic unemployment payment, and the adjusted unemployment rate would have gone north of 30%. But actually in the following 19 months or thereabouts, even as we went through successive further lockdowns, the level of demand for the unemployment payment and the unemployment rate never got back to those heights, because what we could see in practical terms was smaller firms, whether it was retail or hospitality, etc., began to set up more of an online presence and take orders and do deliveries, and began to change their model of how they worked. And I think I think the sight of Amazon vans, etc., delivery vans in local neighbourhoods has now become very, very common in a way that it wouldn't have been, 3 years ago. But that just reflects the fact that that digital shift to online, both in the demand for grants and in the way firms changed how they did business in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a pretty remarkable structural change, actually, and not something that we had seen up until Q1 2020. So we do see more of a digital presence and that digital transformation for micro enterprises. Thank you.
Could I just add to that, Dermot? Thank you very much for that input. Could I just add that what also interesting enough COVID allowed was people time to become, as consumers, more digitally aware. So people had actually the time to learn, whether it was grandchildren or siblings or children or parents or whatever, how to use IT more effectively. So the level of digital use, particularly among the people who were, let's say, 50 or 60 years of age plus, that rose very, very rapidly during that period. And students also, through education, having to be from home during COVID, had a lot of online training on Zoom. So that in turn, there was a lot of digitalization skills generated through that. And the other point that I would notice is the government has been committed to establishing digital hubs around the country. And that is to help smaller enterprises have a place that they can go for sharing their digital experiences and their knowledge with others. I don't know, Linda, whether you wanted to come in on anything on that.
So yes, thank you, Francis, and thank you for having us here today. So the digital hubs that have been rolled out are being used as both a entrepreneurial space and also as a place for remote working. So maybe you don't have the facilities in your own home, but you could go to a remote work facility quite near your place of living and still be able to participate. So this is going to be very important for our regional development. So we can incorporate those smaller towns, those smaller villages, and bringing them alongside. So again, that kind of links back to the sustainability issue that Francis was speaking about earlier, and the sustainability of our regions as well as our large cities and towns. So that digital transformation that's taking place across those digital hubs will be quite important for both the workers and the entrepreneurs that can learn from each other in those spaces.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much. Let me ask Mr. Osama Al-Khareji. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Very clear, yes.
Yes. My name is Osama Al-Khareji. I'm from the private sector. First, I would like to thank National Competitive Center for involving us in this educational seminar, and thank Her Excellency for the informative presentation. My question is, in addition to develop the digital hubs which you developed to support the SMEs, and as you mentioned, it is one of the challenges. What other programs you have developed to help the SMEs to be more competitive, or you're planning to do?
So, thank you very much for your question. So, if I've understood it correctly, I mean, Ireland would have had if you like, a two-pronged approach to its development strategy over a long period of time, and it's now, I would call it actually more a three-pronged approach in the last decade. One part obviously was promoting foreign direct investment, which has been very successful. And as I mentioned in my talk, early on there was a lot more interaction between the domestic foreign direct investment companies that we had in the 70s and 80s than there is today because of global sub-supply. So there is still quite a lot of connection, but it's less so. We're trying to rebuild some of that at the moment because I think global supply has been a bit hit and awareness raised over with COVID about potential vulnerabilities to sub-supply. We've always had supports for small enterprises coming in different forms, but for most part centered on augmenting the skills of employees, giving access to vouchers in order to have research done in colleges and universities to support their products, and increasingly programs which encourage them to go down an innovation route. It's the kind of mainstreaming of that for small enterprises. So there has always been something there. So if you like, we've had I would say really 50 years of engagement between the state and small enterprises who have wanted to engage with the state. And these would be enterprises who are exporting. If they're selling on the domestic market only, what we call, economists would call non-traded sector enterprise, they haven't had that same connection. They have now through digital, but in the past they didn't have. And then also we have, for the more medium-sized enterprises, we have increasing numbers of programs to get them to enhance their capability. And those supports generally are very holistic. They cover obviously digital today, but they would also cover management skills, human resource management skills, exporting and marketing skills, etc. The whole plenty of skills. So companies would be, if you like, they would work with expertise that's within government, but also government would put them in contact with universities, both inside and outside Ireland, to grow their skill sets in order to enhance their capacity to grow, let's say, from not a micro business, but from, let's say, 50 people to 250, if that's you think of employment terms. So in order to get that jump, so that's kind of augmentation, there's policies now for that. So just back to summarize that, traditional ones for supporting and promoting foreign direct investment, smaller and medium ones, and that's moved into the digital space. And then, as I say, for the larger medium companies, to get them to grow to be global players, we've done that. One of the challenges for us is that some of our very successful indigenous software companies are so successful that they're bought out. So we're having a situation now of sort of serial entrepreneurship, as some of those companies have been bought out by others. Sometimes you'd like to grow them, and some of them are growing on their own, but many of them take the opportunity to be bought out by one of the larger companies and to start another new business. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Francis. Please allow me to read one of the questions on the chat box. What role does the private sector play in setting policies and policies' needs and priorities? And how do they partner in developing policies? And finally, how do you measure policy impact?
Okay, so the private sector would interact with government at a whole different range of levels. So I mentioned that we would have two representatives on our council who are private sector, from the two private sector bodies. IBEC, the Irish Business Community, that's basically large business, and ISME, which is for small businesses. So the two representatives on our council are senior figures in the bodies that represent all, if you like, the key players from business. So they play that role. We then obviously have our members of the council who also have direct business experience. Ireland has had a long tradition of social partnership. We have a National Economic and Social Council, and business would be represented on that in addition. So we have had over about 40 years, we've built up, and I call it a web of connections between the private sector and the policy making system. And when we would have our annual budgets, or whenever policy would be made, there would be large scale consultation with the private sector in relation to the decisions being made. So it's not one particular area. We have it for the Competitiveness Council, and we plan to do more in terms of holding, and this is where technology we envisage will actually allow us to hold more webinars with our business communities to get actually more feedback into the process that we're engaged in. But right across the whole Irish economy, I would describe it as being a web of connections between business and the political and policy making, by which I mean the government bureaucrats, if you like, system. I don't know whether Dermot or Linda would like to add anything on that. No, okay, thank you. I don't know whether Dr. Iman, that answers the question.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Let me ask, please, Dr. Sulaiman Al-Khatib, Ministry of Environment.
Okay.
Yeah, we can't hear you. If you can raise your voice a little bit, please.
Okay. Thank you, Excellency, and thank you, Dr. Francis, for this valuable information. I just would like, I know that there are a joint initiative by government of Ireland called Sustainable Food System Ireland, SFSI. And I think this initiative led led by the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and other 4 state agencies, and it support agri-food in Ireland. I would like to know what the measures, tools to support and regulate agri-food and food process sector to make it more competitive and sustainable in Ireland.
Thank you. I have to say straight up that 2 things. One is that Ireland has, over a period of 50 or 60 years, had very strong relationship between government, Department of Agriculture, between the agencies of the government, Department of Agriculture, and the sectoral members in all matters relating to agriculture, implementation of policy. There's always been a huge amount of work done there, and a huge amount of supports both coming from the European Union, European Commission supports, but also from domestically. In relation to the current sustainable food system piece, we have had the development again of agencies very much on the food side in recent times. I personally do not have any of the detail that would require an answer to your question, but we can organise to get that question answered for you offline, unless one of my colleagues has any answer to hand. But it would be an area of specialisation which we wouldn't have on the Competitiveness Council per se. But I'm absolutely happy to be able to, if we get your details, to be able to get information sent on to you in relation to that. But I just want to say is that the relationship with the sector and with the agencies have been there for many years. And it's a little bit like Dr. Nunn said at the beginning, we have a very strong set of cross connections. And so when something needs to change, we basically are building on an infrastructure that's there already, and a set of relationships that are there already. And that would certainly be the case in the context of the food sector, where there would be contact both with the food companies and with the leaders of the agricultural food producing community.
Thank you very much, Dr. Francis. There's a question from the chat box, and actually, had the same question written on my note when you mentioned about the countries that you benchmark with, and you said you benchmark with 19 countries and you have 130 indicators that you have developed to follow up on. But the question was from Ahmed al-Sharqi, those 19 countries, how did you actually come up with that selection? Are they all from the Eurozone? How diverse was the group of these countries? And how did they calibrate for the differences in the legal and economic context between Ireland and the benchmarks?
Okay, that's a very, very important question. Clearly, because we're operating within a European market, the dominant countries that have been in the group since before the EU enlargement have been European countries, because they're where we're competing. We're trying to attract foreign investment to Ireland versus they're trying to attract it to Luxembourg. We're trying to sell in Germany and they're trying to sell in Europe. So there's a sense in which they're absolutely key. So in terms of institutional frameworks and ways of operating, they would be broadly similar. However, we also have countries in there that would be outside of the, I suppose they would be OECD countries primarily, which would be not EU members. The purpose in Ireland, it's an interesting philosophical position. The purpose in Ireland is to challenge yourself with the best. We don't necessarily, we don't think that we can be the best necessarily. Clearly, we can't be the best across every metric, but we actually do want to put a challenge out there to say, why are we not as good as the Finns in terms of education? Why are we not as good as the Danes in terms of climate? Why are we not? What are we doing? What are they doing that we're not doing? So it's very much coming from that. And I do recall, historically, because of our relationship with the United Kingdom, it was for many decades, up until maybe the 1980s, what are they doing in the UK? If we were doing as well as the UK, that was good enough. And they have an almost identical legal system to ours, and they have a budgetary system that's very similar to ours. They're the most similar. The rest of the EU are differences to different effects, and there's a sense in which small countries can do things that can do things that big countries can't, and vice versa. So we tend to look in a lot of occasions when we're doing deep dives at the Nordic countries, because they're extremely strong in terms of the quality of life that they give their citizens, of the way in which they manage so many different policy areas of government. But we also will challenge ourselves with Southern European countries, or with Canada, or with New Zealand. We're members of this group of small, I've forgotten the name of it, small industrializing countries or whatever, which is Singapore and New Zealand. And so it's just, I mean, the spirit for us is of challenge, of saying, you know, they do this really well. What could we do that better? Why isn't that? And then you suddenly realize sometimes they're doing something. So, for example, if you're comparing yourself with Singapore, that's an entirely different regime, institutional setting. So clearly you can do things in Singapore that you can't do things in Ireland. But can you do things in Ireland better than you're currently doing them, learning from something that they're doing? So I think I think the philosophy with the Competitiveness Council is really important, that it's not defensive, that it's challenge. It's not self-destructive either. It's just challenging yourself to say, wow, how is that working? Could we do that?
Thank you very, very much. Can I ask Mr. Riyad Al-Farisi to ask a question, please?
Yes, good afternoon.
Clear, good afternoon.
Thank you.
My question to Her Excellency, Dr. Francis, was there any resistance from the government side? When I say government side, I say the government sectors that has a relation with the private sector. When you started this model in this remarkable journey? And the other question is, was there any participation from the private sector, either challenges or ideas throughout this journey? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a really good question. I think that the private sector was behind this from the very beginning, because what the private sector saw was that while government in Ireland had some good enterprise policies, other parts of the system didn't necessarily work in the interests of enterprise. So the fact that this was whole of government meant that it was extremely well received by the private sector. We had actually a major government commission, but a major government report done in the early 1990s, where it was pointed out, and this report was full of businessmen and women, along with economists. And what they pointed out was that so many of the issues that were impediments to their growth and reduced their competitiveness as companies were actually not the responsibility of the enterprise sector. So they came from the transportation sector in how it wasn't investing in roads. They came from the port sector in terms of the fact that the infrastructure wasn't built that was sufficient to deal with their needs. It came from a whole range of other areas where they saw, despite government enterprise sector being supportive of them, other parts of the system worked against them. So maybe it's because of that unique starting point. It was always seen as something that was in the interest, it was business getting its broader voice represented at the center of government. And I think that you're quite right to point to that history has mattered with the fact that it has had enormous acceptance. And its acceptance, as I say, is by industry. Yes, you might have some comments made that wouldn't like particular things that would be said, but the acceptance of it as a group has been extremely strong. It's been very accepted by the politicians on all parts of the House, because they see it as identifying challenges that are there that the economy has to deal with. And of course, politicians with different perspectives might choose one or other item to focus their attention on, but by and large, it has had huge acceptance and continues to have acceptance. And I think that's because it's gone for the evidence base, the external approach, then combined with research on the domestic economy to fill out and understand how our performance is not improving or could improve more.
Thank you very much, Dr. Francis. I actually have a few questions for you, and I'll ask them one at a time. First of all, how do you encourage enterprises to become more productive? Because as you know, as I talked to you earlier, we've introduced our Competitiveness 2.0 plan. And our three pillars were productivity, inclusiveness, and sustainability. But now we want to actually translate these into actual initiatives that we want to encourage the private sector to adhere to become more ESG driven. But how do you actually encourage those enterprises to become more productive for the best of their business?
So I mean, I suppose the key thing, if you go back to, again, the OECD framework is very helpful here. What are the drivers of competitiveness? So very often it's around skilled labor. It's around improving the management of skills. It's around putting together programs that would help would help those enterprises to upskill. I mean, a large enterprise can have specialisms across a whole range of things. A small enterprise can't. So basically having initiatives that combine pieces and that are very enterprise-centered. I mean, I would say that our policies in Ireland are very historically enterprise-centered. Each, as I think I may have said in passing, each project was looked at on its own merits. We don't take a broad brush sectoral approach. We very much take an enterprise-centered approach. So there would be series of initiatives available through, and maybe one of my colleagues might like to comment on this. Dermot, would you like to come in on that?
Sorry, no, I don't think I have too much to add to that, actually.
Have you not? Okay.
That really covers that point, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So basically what we would have is a whole series of initiatives. We would have, around the country, would have regional offices that support economic development or development of businesses. People would have access in their local town or in their nearest big town, big city, to applying for and availing of supports. Very often it's training, and there's a whole set of bodies in Ireland, or businesses, if you like, which are around helping companies to come out of, if you like, up their game and their role in terms of improving productivity. There would be mentorship programs from people who had been in industry previously who would be there. It's like there's a whole plethora of supports already in place. And I mean, the point that we would make in the council, in our report last year, we commented on asking the government agencies who oversee those initiatives to review them again in the context of COVID, to make sure that the digital aspect of that has been done. Because sometimes it can happen is you have a set of initiatives, they're really good, but they get past their sell-by date. So we asked that they all be reviewed, and that's being done at the moment to make sure that they're relevant to the needs of enterprises at this stage. But as I say, we've had many of those, and the websites are full of actually, I sometimes wonder if we almost have too much information, too many options, that you sometimes, if you have a surplus of policies, the cost on the business of discovering which one is most relevant to them, I think, can be significant. So it's very important to prune and review those initiatives and make sure that, at least every three to 5 years, that they are actually fit for purpose of what the issues are of today.
Hey, Francis, can I just come in there on the point you mentioned about, say, those regional structures? It's important to bear in mind as well that as firms look to move up the value chain, there are supports that the broader state infrastructure would provide. So, for instance, for a firm that wants to, say, refit so it can, improve its productivity or mechanization, etc., the state, through the Public Employment Service and the education and training boards, would provide, say, short-time working supports. So employees, maybe the firm has a retrofit, but the state then would provide the training to work new machinery and would pay some of the wages or the earnings of the staff to facilitate an enterprise to go through that change. And it's also worth bearing in mind as well that one of our national enterprise agencies, which is Enterprise Ireland, they run a series of kind of productivity hubs where they will examine Ireland's productivity and how we do our business in a certain sector, and then seek to encourage firms to move up the value chain. So, for instance, I think they're looking at the construction industry. How is it that we do that type of work in Ireland, and what changes do we need to embrace? New materials, new ways of working, etc. And that particular agency also operates a productivity improvement fund, which will provide financial assistance to firms who, as I said, are trying to move up the value chain by adopting new technologies, new ways of working, etc. So I think, as per Francis' point, there's quite a depth to all those supports, and perhaps that can be a little bit confusing also for farmers who want to navigate that system. Thank you.
And that's where I think the benefits of local offices, where somebody can talk to somebody face to face, to almost like a broker, a knowledge broker, to how to get into that system. So I hope that answers the question.
Excellent, very good. That's a very big topic, actually, and we definitely will need your assistance and help with that moving forward, actually, during our future partnership with you. The next question is, Saudi Arabia's economy is trying to wean off from oil and gas into diversifying the economy in almost all sectors. Now, that's a huge agenda. And what we're trying to do in the National Competitiveness Center, along with all the government entities and working hand in hand with the private sector, we're trying to actually achieve those targets for Vision 2030. What is your advice for Saudi Arabia, for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to encourage this diversification in the right direction, with the right speed, because we need to do it in quite a good speed. And but not only that, but to become efficient in doing it, to become sustainable in doing it, and to become actually more productive in doing it. And at the same time, encourage local and foreign investors to come and invest in Saudi Arabia to develop these new sectors, because in a lot of them, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the skills. We need some knowledge transfer, we need the talent. And you talked about Ireland's experience and the immigrants when they came back with all these skills. We have a transition period while we're trying to build our talent in Saudi Arabia. We will have to immigrate some talent to Saudi Arabia to help us into this transition. What is your advice to Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
So I mentioned when I was speaking, and I think it's probably the most important point to make, that creating an environment that is as stable as possible in terms of government signaling what it's doing, being clear on what it wants to achieve, because private businesses have to make decisions where their money is on the line. And if government is very clear on what it's doing and where it's going, or as clear as it can be, not perfection is the enemy of the good, as clear as it can be on that, I think it's really important. Foreign investors, we have always worked on the basis of making it easy for foreign investors to come into Ireland. Our personality type, if you like, is that we like to engage with people. We like to be supportive in terms of when they come in, showing them the ropes. So let me give you an example, which I remember people were very shocked about many years ago, but a lot of the Industrial Development Authority, which is our major agency for foreign direct investment, when it would be talking to foreign companies about coming to Ireland, and this could be Intel, this could be Ericsson, this could be anybody coming in, they would bring them, if they've never worked in Ireland before, they would bring them to meet existing FDI leaders. And they would show them around the plant, show them what they were doing. They would talk to them. And you say, well, why would they be showing potential competitors how good it is to be in Ireland? Because they felt that if the whole growth of the Irish economy came up, it would enrich the labour market, it would enrich the skill sets, it would be hugely enriching. So effectively, many of our leaders of American companies were major promoters of investment by other American companies in Ireland. Now, I think the system has become so rich at this stage that probably isn't part of the sales pitch. I need to check it now that I think about it, but it was for decades. Now, if you're starting something that you haven't had before, having allies among your foreign direct investors so that what they're saying to people is, yes, it is possible to do business here. Yeah, this is a bit slow. This takes a bit longer. What you need to do is get your this done. You need to get your that done. So you want to make it easy for them, not by having weak regulations, by having good regulations, appropriate regulations, but having them accessible and possible for the foreign investors to come into. Then when you're talking about local people, wanting to get them to up their game and invest further, you want to recognize that they're constrained all the time. Unlike the big multinationals who've got a lot of resources outside the country who can draw them in and pull them out, they then are more dependent on, in fact, your local skills coming back in, your former Saudis returning. And one of the things that for this is, and I was on the Council of Economic Advisors in Scotland for many years, and they were always trying to say, well, how we lose the best of our graduates to London when they leave Edinburgh and Glasgow, how do we get them back? And I said, You get them back by making the place very attractive to somebody who's around 30 years of age, maybe thinking of starting a family and wants to live outside the world that hasn't been the homeland that they brought up. So you make sure it's attractive to them. It's easy for somebody to resettle back home. And also that home, and I think this is one of the cultural changes that happened in Ireland, was we were more or less completely indigenous population until relatively recently. We now have multitudes and multitudes of people from different ethnic backgrounds. And that's actually very attractive to people who've been in other countries and are coming back to a kind of very monocultural thing. They like to see a broadening. They like to see change. So I think it's what I would say is think about it from the point of view of the people working in the companies, the foreign investors saying, do Saudis really want us to come? Because if they don't, they might say they do, but if they're not doing it for real, it has to be for real, and it has to be about helping them to address the challenges that working in Saudi Arabia has, not to change the rules for them, not to bend the rules for them, but to make the challenges something that they can operate it and they know. I would also say that I think momentum will be really important. So I'd be worried about rushing too quickly and slowing down. I'd be doing a build-up. So if you're doing your big infrastructure projects, if you're doing that, you graduate that upwards. You do make sure one thing that happens is that the planning of the infrastructure projects means that they make sense. I mean, one thing we did was in the 1990s, we got European money and we built a huge number of roads. And that was hugely important. And that infrastructure changed the country. We did not invest in urban transport at the time. We didn't invest early enough in working out how our cities work. And, there's this huge literature now that growth and productivity derives mostly in cities, and making sure your cities work so that people can get to their place of work, can live in reasonable setting, that they're not spending a huge amount of time in commuting. So making sure your cities work, particularly, and I think I've read somewhere that you're planning to grow your cities very significantly, but making sure that urban infrastructure is there. We didn't do that. We had to retrofit it. We're still retrofitting it. It still takes time, and we're still trying to work on that on that model. So I would be going a logistic curve. I would be getting the right core things done. But the main thing for the private sector, I think, is to create an environment that they believe is secure in terms of making their investment, and they're investing in something where there's lack of uncertainty. And just a final one on that was, when we were growing our ICT sector, we did it slowly, and there was one other country in Europe, and I won't mention which one it was, but it rushed to do this too quickly. It then didn't have the labour supply. It then didn't have the mechanisms for doing it, and they actually got a setback from which they didn't recover. So I think it's really important to try to do it in a way that the momentum carries the goes forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Francis. There was a lot of questions, and we also have a question. We have created our own subcommittee in the National Competitiveness Center on cost of doing business. I've seen you mentioning developing a report 3 times a year that you report on the cost of doing business. But again, what is really the real cost of doing business, and how competitive can a country be, and who do you compare yourself with when you're doing the cost of doing business? How do you measure it, and how do you measure it end to end, from the beginning and starting your business and then operating your business? And how do you really benchmark when it comes to cost of doing business? We understand that you talked about, stability and being stable in our regulations and having a momentum. Well, with all the change that Saudi Arabia is going through, and because, again, we were trying to catch up, there were a lot of changes in the regulatory framework, and it needs to be done. We need it to be a good benchmark for investors, whether they're local or international investors. And that's why we had to develop our regulatory framework to actually align with the rest of the world. But again, with that comes a lot of changes, and maybe they're not going to be stable for a long time. And also some of the changes that actually came through were some of the fees that were introduced. And because of also the changes in the economy, whether it is COVID or even before that, and even after that, we don't know what's going to happen now with all the crises that is happening in the world. The taxation system has been also changing quite regularly, and there were increases in the also in the labor market costs. All of these fees are actually added fees to the investors. What is your advice, and how can we actually balance between our fiscal framework and also our investments and developing the private sector, and also developing a good regulatory system that will be sustainable for a country to carry on its economy in the best possible way? So I know it's a loaded question, I'm sorry, but it is.
It's a big question. I mean, I suppose the first thing I would say to you is, as far as possible, move a little more slowly to avoid changing direction. And I know that sometimes is not possible to avoid, but certainly looking at what's happened to us with regard to giving climate signals and others, moving in a way that gives clarity, I think is really helpful. And we have had, for example, a very consistent tax system for a very long period of time. And we'll be going through some changes ourselves in the near future. I think signaling changes in advance is also very sensible, being open about them, that this is going to have to change or something is going to have to be done in relation to that, and talking about it, and actually, using government documents and using partnership models to socialize those ideas. Now, first of all, in relation to costs, I want to say one thing: we do not look at costs on a quarterly basis at all. That may just be the way this slide looked. What we have been using for doing cost of doing business is the World Bank report on that, which has not appeared this year thus far. But what we do is that's our main source, and what the World Bank tries to do is exactly what you talked about. And I don't know whether they do it for Saudi or not, but what they did was they would come in and look at end-to-end services. So, for example, we had a report done, and maybe Linda, you might like to talk about that, the report that was done on different cities in Ireland in terms of cost of doing business. Maybe you'd talk to that for a moment.
Yes, so this was at the end of 2019 as part of a European initiative to look at the regional development of countries. The World Bank came in and did an assessment of the 5 largest towns in sort of smaller cities in Ireland. And what was very interesting to us was they looked at things like getting connected to the electricity grid, registering your business, and how long they would take in both in terms of time and money. And what was very interesting for Ireland as a whole was that if each of our cities learned from the best practice of each other, we would improve our ranking in the World Bank competitiveness indicators by 6 or 7 positions. So really, this was already happening in Ireland. We could learn from our own best practices to improve our overall competitiveness position. So it was maybe easier to get a building permit in one city. So what were they doing that was making that more efficient, and what was making it more effective for industry, for businesses? In another place, it might have been cheaper or quicker to have a legal resolution to an issue. So what were they doing there that was helping to speed it up in terms of both time and money for the enterprises? So there really was a lot to learn there from ourselves. And of course, then we're still learning from best practice internationally as well.
Thank you, Dr. Francis and Linda. Let me just ask a question here. You're talking about starting a business, cost of doing business, or the whole end-to-end?
So it looks end-to-end, but they picked up on a number of indicators. So one of them was the cost of registering your business initially.
Yeah,
and then
because that's one of their indicators, and I think they've measured it for all countries. But what I'm really interested in, not only starting a business, but starting operating year on year in different sectors. I think that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody. I mean, it's extremely difficult once you get into these detailed pieces, and we have not any methodology other than what the World Bank has produced in relation to that. We've done occasional reports at different stages. There've been some chapters work done on individual sectoral pieces, but it's come back onto the agenda now, I think, Dr. Mann, in a very big way because of inflation. So there may well be new issues where we can all be looking to each other to learn from in terms of how we actually look for that. But to me, I mean, from an investor point of view, uncertainty is your biggest cost, because uncertainty is time is money, and as I say, I often think that that's the biggest thing that politicians and civil servants need to understand, that time is money for an investor, and you can give up. You can just stop, decide it's not worth happening. So when you mentioned about making change in a way that people feel confident that the change is there to stick is really, really important. And if you do have to redo a change, you're completely transparent about it. You say, we did this, and the complication was this, and therefore we're doing that. And we've had to, and sometimes people like to bury, if something goes wrong, you try to bury it. Being transparent about it is absolutely the best thing, because otherwise it'll carry on and it's not what you want. It's like I mentioned earlier on with, is the training that facilities that are being, supports that are being provided for medium enterprises, are they the right ones now in this new digital context, in post-COVID, etc. So I would suggest that developing a dialogue and framework which allows you to recalibrate, because the scale of change you're talking about is massive. So think if you were a business, you'd know that there'd be mistakes made with the big change. So why doesn't government try to create an environment of a discourse which allows you to recalibrate when something that was done didn't work, and therefore we are going to do this? No need to apologize. These things happen, but you deal with them in a way that I think grows the confidence of the business sector. Yeah, they made the mistake on that, but actually, in fairness to them, they did that, they corrected it, and we moved on.
Well, Dr. Francis, Dr. Dermot, and Linda, this brings us to the end of our session. You have been extremely generous in answering all the questions, and I'm sorry that there weren't too many questions, but I think the topic is very exciting. Everybody, actually, I think we have loads more questions, but I do apologize if I didn't read all of them. I tried to combine a few together in one question so we can answer most of your questions. But we're grateful to your time. We are grateful with the information that you passed through. We definitely look forward for your visit in Saudi Arabia. So thank you on behalf of all my audience very much for having this session with us. And we hope to see you again in many more sessions coming, but maybe this time it will be physical. Thank you all very much, Dr. Francis and team. Thank you.
Shukran.
Thank you so much. I wish I can actually know the word in Irish as well.
We'll organize that.
That's great. Thank you very much, and you have a lovely day. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. And thank you all, the audience.
Thank you. Bye-bye.